It's your boy, the Mick Parkin of I'd Rather Be Watching Lorenz Larkin, Jack Slack. It's the Jack Slack podcast, and we're coming at you midweek ahead of UFC 304. There was a fight over the weekend between Werner Jandiroba and Amanda Lemos. Wasn't bad, but you didn't watch it, so maybe we'll talk about it later. But I thought, why not focus on the pay-per-view? This is a peculiar one, because almost 20 years to the day after UFC 49 unfinished business, we've got UFC 304 unfinished business. The original unfinished business was Randy Couture versus Vitor Belfort. They'd fought once and then they fought a second time for the light heavyweight title. And the first punch that Vitor Belfort throws misses Randy Couture's head. The corner of his glove slices down the top side of Randy Couture's bottom eyelid. You couldn't do it with a scalpel. It was crazy, that cut. So Couture apparently had to have stitches in a... I can only imagine that that's very painful, or at least uncomfortable and gross, having the top of your eyelid stitched. But 6 months later, they did unfinished business, and that was the third fight between the two of them, even though they'd only had like one and a bit fights before that. And the two top fights on this UFC 304 card are sequels to fights that only sort of happened. One of them more so than the other. Belal versus Leon, a good amount happened in the 1 round and like 15 seconds that occurred in the first fight. Tom Aspinall versus Curtis Blades, the entire fight was 15 seconds. Now, I'm not saying there isn't anything to be drawn from that, and we will get into that in a minute, but that's a weird situation to be in, that this is Blades versus Aspinall 2, and the first fight, you know, you blinked and you missed it. There's some other stuff on this card that's fine. It's kind of standard British card fodder. Here are all your Brits in fights that range from good to what? And a couple where you're like, I know they're British, but do they have to fight on our card? But we're up in Manchester. I was going to do a big thing about smokestacks and the children coming out of the workhouse to watch the fights or read the papers. But Manchester is booming. The housing prices up there are going through the roof. And this is a brand new stadium, I think with the first sporting event in the Co-op Stadium. So folks are going to be watching it through 1 or 2 monocles and opera glasses. But what better place for the Brummie Mumbler himself, Leon Edwards, a man who came from the profoundest poverty and now earns a decent dentist's salary as the UFC welterweight champion. Let's get into it. Main event, Leon Edwards versus Belal Muhammad. I wrote an article. If you've not read it, I dropped it at the start of the week on the Patreon called Lessons from Leon versus Belal 1. I think I used their surnames because it was professional. That was something they used to get on me about in writing. It was like, sometimes you use their first names and sometimes you use their second name. Stick to the second name. But in that article, I discussed the stuff from the first fight, which honestly quite a lot happened in that first fight. Uncharacteristically aggressive performance from Leon Edwards, as we all remember, but still the classic Leon Edwards looks. The southpaw double attack being the most important one, the left straight and the left high kick, and the left body kick to a lesser extent. If you don't know how that works, think of Mirko Cro Cop. If you don't know Mirko Cro Cop, damn, aren't these kids following MMA today young? Go look up a highlight. But when you're in an open stance matchup, southpaw versus orthodox or orthodox versus southpaw, the rear hand straight shoots down the line of what would have been the jab. So you take a little step outside the opponent's lead foot, you throw your rear straight, right if you're an orthodox fighter, left if you're a southpaw fighter, and that shoots down the line that was the jab. The ways to deal with that, typically, most people want to stay in range so that they can throw something back. But the ways you deal with it are to, or if you just can't get away from it by backing up, you parry it with your rear hand. So your rear hand comes forward and slaps it across, or you slip your head outside it to the elbow side. Both of those take you into the path of the high kick. So a couple of examples from Cro Cop's career. Igor Vovchanchin gets hit with the left straight a couple of times, reaches for it, gets kicked over that arm, because when you reach forward to parry the punch, the only thing that's stopping that kick hitting you on the open side on your head, your forearm has moved forward, they can throw it up behind it. Mark Hunt against Cro Cop slips to the outside of Cro Cop's left hand, so Cro Cop fakes and throws the left high kick up, and Mark Hunt leans into it. And Mark Hunt has one of the all-time great chins, so Mark Hunt calls him the C word and stands back up. But Leon Edwards does it all the time. You'll remember the Kamaru Usman knockout. Kamaru Usman reaches and leans and gets kicked in the head with nothing in the way. That's the wonderful thing about the Southpaw versus Orthodox matchup. From both ends, it works for the Orthodox fighter in their matchup too. When you're on opposite foot to the opponent, both of you are kicking towards the opponent's backhand with your power leg. So it's your most powerful kick against basically just against their arm. So anytime that they're throwing, they're in danger. Anytime that they're reaching for something, they're in danger. It's a real gunfight if you've got a good high kick and you're fighting in an open stance engagement. In the article, I talked about scoring the left straight as a southpaw or a right straight as an orthodox fighter, but scoring it as a standalone shot. A lot of boxing coaching is about teaching people to throw the right hand and then teaching them to shorten up that right hand so that their left hook can land after and then their right hand can land again, and then ad infinitum. Ideally, you hit them with 1,000 punches and they just melt into a bloody puddle. But if you throw your right straight as far as you can, so you turn your shoulders, you pull your left shoulder back, that's a really good trick for getting a nice long piston of a right straight as an orthodox fighter. Pull your left shoulder back. Don't focus on throwing your right shoulder forward. Pull your left shoulder back. And you can make your stance, you can make your shoulders basically reverse so that your left shoulder's behind you and your right shoulder's in front. That you get as much of a line as possible and you get a really long right straight. And no one throws their jab like that when they're looking to set up their right hand. So if you throw your right hand like that, or as Leon did his left hand, it exceeds the distance that your jab will. So what happened in this fight was that Leon would jab in, fall just short, and Bilal would be moving back and going, okay, he's not hit me. And then the left hand would go bang and come in like a foot longer than the jab did. So he was never in position to follow up with punches, but he was scoring this left straight, which is incredibly important because it doesn't matter if you score like a jab or a left straight off the bat, or if you set it up cleverly, the guy is only going to be thinking about defending that left straight. So Bilal's hand starts coming forward. There's a couple of instances where he's going backwards, the punch falls short, but he's still reaching out to parry it. And I think his eyes are closed in a couple of them too. And then eventually, I think about 3 minutes in, Leon Edwards throws the high kick up. Bilal's hand is way out of position. He hits him on the side of the head. I think he cuts him open and wobbles him. And fair play to Bilal because he recovers really well. But that looked to be the pattern that the fight was taking, because if you're doing that by round one, you've established that threat and you've got him reaching like that in round one, the chances of him doing something more disciplined in round 2, 3, 4, 5 as the fight goes on, they're not great, to be honest. If he's already doing his panic reaction and it's getting him into trouble, he's not going to become more measured and deal with it in a better way in round 2. However, he's been away. And now he's had loads of time to work with people. If you're fighting Leon Edwards, I would get a southpaw who's just going to throw left straights and high kicks at you all day, every day, and make sure you're sparring them regularly. If Bilal turns up looking like he can catch kicks in there's loads of ways to catch kicks. There's loads of sports that catch kicks. The Muay Thai style, the Sanshao style. There's a load of them, but they mainly involve two hands. But he looks like he can catch those kicks on the open side at all. He can actually start making Leon Edwards pay. The only problem is that to catch kicks like that, you have to take them on the outside forearm, and then you end up eating the left straights because you're not reacting to them. Bilal's striking in that fight it was a mix. When he got close enough and jabbed, he actually hit Leon and annoyed him. And he was doing a lot of skipping stone jabs, which are where you slap from a southpaw versus orthodox matchup, you slap their lead hand down and you throw your jab immediately, because their lead hand is what's obstructing your jab. But he was doing really well with those, like 4 or 5 times in that one round. He landed good jabs. But most of the fight, he's lunging forward, throwing the right hand and trying to step through southpaw and double the right hand, like Volkanovski did when Max Holloway went southpaw and against Islam Makhachev. Good way to cover a lot of distance, but Volkanovski tends to do it near the fence so that he traps the guy. Bilal's just doing it out in the open and falling forwards, and Leon's going back and to the left every time, back and to the left. Still haven't got that sound on my soundboard from JFK, but he just, every time Bilal loads up, runs forward, leaves himself wide open, but then realizes Leon's leaving distance and just gives up. And that's the thing, like, any good fighter is going to move when you move at them. Going like, oh, I failed now, and letting them reset is real basic fighting. What you want to be doing is making sure that their movement counts for something. If you move at someone and they back up and circle out, you make sure that you move across so that they're closer to the fence the next time they retreat and circle out. if you treat every exchange as a new thing, everything unfolds in the middle of the cage, and people like Leon Edwards will just have a field day. Because if you watch Leon Edwards versus Vicente Luque, back before anyone really cared about either fighter, actually, even though Vicente Luque was on a great streak, Leon Edwards really bamboozles him by like standing right in front of him, showing him lots of feints, and then throwing up really fast kicks and left straights. No combinations really, just feints and very fast real strikes. Really low commitment, keeps circling out, and Vicente Luque's a pressure guy, but he just he can't corner Leon Edwards, he can't do anything with him really, because every time he leaves, he just leaves distance. There isn't a single strike in the world that works if you move back far enough. Which is why almost every beginner's kickboxing class is just guys running backwards. But then a lot of UFC stuff, if you watch Dustin Poirier's early career in the UFC, until probably about like the Jim Miller fight, he's run forwards, run backwards, run forwards, run backwards. It's about learning not to run away from the opponent so that you can stay there and counter, and it's about using the opponent's retreats to put him near the fence. The fence is all the difference in the world because it's like you have a friend holding him in place. The moment you start moving someone towards the fence, 180 degrees of the circle around them that they can move in disappears. Even if they're really slick and they move well, you've cut down their options by about half. Now, the fence work in the first fight was interesting. Leon went in first for the double underhooks and tried to drop in a takedown, but Bilal looked really good. He was leaning off to the side to create space to pummel his hand back in. And then Bilal was landing the elbows on the break, which was really cool because that's Leon Edwards' game. That's what he's good at. And I'm always saying every time he fights, I go, oh, I wish more people did that. That's brilliant, Leon Edwards. But Leon was so busy trying to defend Bilal's attempt at getting in on takedowns and deal with Bilal's pummeling that Bilal was able to land the elbows. I think he only landed one good one, but he tried a couple. But yeah, they worked really well. There's a great bit where Bilal gets double underhooks along the cage on Leon, and you get to see just the variety and the constant movement that Leon's doing from the really bad position along the cage. They're talking about an Islam Makhachev Leon Edwards fight, and I don't like holding up divisions and doing stupid cross weight fights that much, but it would be a lot of fun to see their cage wrestling matchup because basically what makes Leon the best in the world right now, he's a decent striker. I mean, he's a good striker. He's a very fast striker. He's a clever striker, but he's very hard to take down. He always gets back up. He breaks off the cage really well. I mean, he'll surprise you by doing things like elbowing and kneeing you off the break. And even like round one, Kamaru Usman fight number 2, he gets put back to the fence, and he gets a body lock deep enough that he can use it to suck Kamaru's hips in and step round him and go straight to mount on Kamaru Usman from a really bad position. Who can do that? I mean, Islam Makhachev throws people from bad positions, but that's why that matchup's so intriguing. But yeah, it was pretty stalemated, the grappling along the cage in that fight. But again, this is round 1 of a fight that was a main event, so it was 5 rounds. So they weren't going out there and going crazy. Leon Edwards was fighting aggressively, and he tried to get a quick stoppage because he was in a really weird spot in his career because he lost that Tyron Woodley fight due to the UK bringing in travel restrictions. And Gilbert Burns took that fight on short notice and got a title shot off it. So he really had to try and make an impression. He doesn't typically fight that aggressive anymore, or before that either. But it was the opening round. It was a feeling out process. It was not. You can garner some stuff from it, but like Leon Edwards attempted a takedown because he wanted to see if he could get a takedown. I don't think he attempted the takedown because he was like, I need to finish him in round 1 by getting this takedown now, and if I don't get it, I'm going to attempt the takedowns constantly for the next 4 rounds. It was just him seeing what he could do. And as the fight progresses, you'll see other things be successful. And good guys like Leon Edwards and partly Bilal Muhammad, people don't like him because there's not an awful lot you can grab onto that's interesting about his fighting style. But that's sort of the curse of the generalist. If you can say like, oh, I've got a few things I'm good at and I just adjust the levels, play with the sliders, as I always say, to whatever is working against the opponent and whatever my opponent's strengths are. The idea of the Bruce Lee be water thing, if you really were like a formless fighter who could just do a bit of everything and adapt to the opponent perfectly, it would be very hard to catch on with people because what you need is like selling points. You need like a signature move. You need to be WWE going out there and spamming L1, the Conor McGregor left hand and so on. That's what people can grab onto. If you're well-rounded and you're just trying to be the perfect foil for your opponent, you don't give fans a lot to like about you. Especially if you're not getting finishes either. That doesn't help. So I gave some hypothetical game plans in my article, but I think Leon Edwards, you got to keep doing what you were doing and hope that Bilal Muhammad just wants to run at you out in the center of the cage and try and push you to the fence that way, because it was terrible. It wasn't working at all. The left straight and the left high kick are always going to... The reason that double attack is so strong is because it's not saying, oh, you're forgetting about this one thing. You know, you don't forget about the left high kick when you're dealing with the left straight. You don't forget about the left straight when you're dealing with the left high kick. It's that to get to one, you have to take a disadvantage, get into the other. You can't be in two spots at once. Your rear hand on the open side can't be in two spots at once. So you're giving them a dilemma, and at some point, something's going to get through well. I'd say, you know, sometimes when you've got guys who are really good kickers, I'd say, you know, pick up your leg and cross-check. But Bilal got hit on one leg pretty hard in the very early going of that fight. He got up on one leg and Leon came in with a left hand. With someone like that, it's not necessarily the best thing. If someone's got a really good left straight and they're using it lots, it's not necessarily the best thing to try and do the belt and braces approach to checking their kicks. I think circling to the outside of the lead foot is always a good way to hinder throwing up high kicks and shooting left straights. If you can keep doing that while crowding in on him. I think crowding Leon Edwards is the most important thing for Bilal Muhammad here. In the article I said, you just got to accept that getting hit is the price of admission. It's one of those things where if you crowd him, you're going to get hit, but you're going to be able to hit him. He's probably going to hit you less because he's a bit of a perfectionist. He likes to circle out and try and re-engage out in the open rather than win the exchange. You've got a great chance of him running onto the fence if you fluster him. And life is much, much worse if you go, oh, I don't want to run in because he might hit me, and you just let him stand at distance, hip faking and shooting long shots that he hits you for free and you don't get anything back. Very intrigued to see how the cage wrestling plays out. I imagine most fans are not, because it's what both these guys are known for. Bilal being grindy on the fence and Leon Edwards being very skilled at stopping people along the fence and turning it around, but not necessarily the funnest thing in the world. That's where we are at the moment in MMA. Cage wrestling is all the difference. That's what makes the sport what it is, and people who are good at it stand out. But it certainly isn't the part that sells tickets. Another thing to note on this one, and on the topic of cage wrestling, and on the subject of all the difficulty that Bilal Muhammad was having out in the open, was that the first fight was fought in the Apex, in a tiny cage, and this fight will be fought in a big cage on the road. It's insane that the UFC does two different cage sizes, and with more and more fights being held in the Apex, more and more fights are being held in this tiny cage. If you want a really obvious example of this, go and watch the two fights between Chito Vera and Sean O'Malley. The first fight, Chito Vera is able to sort of walk him down towards the cage just by having a high guard and walking at him. And the second fight, like, they never get close to the cage because it's 50% bigger in terms of total space. I know there are sports where pitches are different lengths. I think in football, some of them are a weird length. And obviously in racing sports, all tracks are different except NASCAR. But you would think they'd want a standardized size for the UFC rather than, or at least for, I don't know, top 10 fights. I suppose title fights only really happen on pay-per-views. But it is proper weird. I suppose it's like, you know, you only get 5 rounds once you're main eventing. So in the lower divisions where you never main event, you're going to get 5 rounds basically for the first time in your title shot. And then you're going to gas out and everyone's going to go, what a bum, gassed out. Anyway, co-main event, Tom Aspinall versus Curtis Blades. I think this is an intriguing one. I could see a lot of people writing Curtis Blades off. Curtis Blades is a habitual underperformer, I would say, based on like how well he's taken to the skill of striking and the wrestling chops that he has in a division that's so short on wrestlers. I mean, look what Jailton Almeida was able to do until he met Curtis Blades, who said, oh, hang on, no, I can do a bit of this. But he does sort of like lack the pop. He's not a big hitter, certainly on the feet. I mean, the elbows he hit over him with on the ground were pretty impressive. He kind of fails in the heavyweight things that people like about heavyweights. Tom Aspinall, he's taken some people down, he's ground and pounded some people, he's punched people, he's submitted a couple of people. He knocks people out on the feet. He's everything you want from a heavyweight. He barely ever goes past the first minute. But even in that fight against Sergey Pavlovich, he didn't. We are all like, oh, what a well-rounded fighter, but he fought Sergey Pavlovich in the dumbest way. He went straight at him and fought like chin for chin. And then just recently, Sergey Pavlovich fought Volkov, who knew him, and demonstrated that he's terrible at actually getting to you if you know how to use distance a little bit. Throw the odd check and kick to the lead knee. But at the time, Sergey Pav was like a largely unknown fighter. The only thing that he had was that loss to Overeem, which is crazy because he got out-wrestled in that fight, even though his base style, TM, is supposed to be Greco-Roman. But yeah, I mean, he was a scary guy and almost completely unknown. For Tom Aspinall to go out there and do that was very impressive. But looking back, it was not a smart way to fight. And revisiting this fight in preparation for this card, as I wrote in the article, he made 3 unforced errors within the space of 15 seconds. 3 times he steps in with a rear leg kick, and all 3 times Blades tries. 2 times he succeeds to step up the middle and punch Tom Aspinall in the face. And Blades has wacky inflatable hammers for hands, so it didn't do much. But that same opening, if you go watch Fedor's career, or Igor Vovchanchin's career before him, but Fedor particularly, Fedor was a master at bouncing around on the outside until the guy threw the low kick, because that was the age of MMA where people were just like, I'm not going to be able to step in on him, I might try a low kick. And they'd throw a low kick and he'd step in, time the right hand up the middle, and drive through with his head. And you know, drape a hand over the leg as it was on his thigh. He'd let them kick him in the leg, drape the hand over the top, throw the right hand. And if he hit him, great. If he didn't, great. But they always fell on their back afterwards, and then he was on top. If you watch MVP versus Douglas Lima, he gets credited with 2 or 3 knockdowns that aren't knockdowns. He just runs into Lima while Lima's on one leg. But the effect in MMA is considerably worse than it would be in kickboxing, because you're then on top for as long as it takes the other guy to fight his way back up. Now, Curtis Blades was just throwing right hands in that fight, but if he timed the same step up the middle and he draped a hand over the leg loosely, he would be able to run through Aspinall onto the mat. Or at least get pretty deep on his hips. Aspinall might be able to dig an underhook, pull him up and stuff, but it's Aspinall putting himself in a position of disadvantage because he wanted to get to work with his rear leg so quickly. He throws a right knee and then he throws 2 right low kicks straight off the bat. And he takes some punches on the face doing it. He was so aggressive in that fight. He's an interesting mix, Tommy, because some of the stuff you see and you go, damn, these guys are actually training like professionals, and they really do get it. And he's a very well-rounded fighter, and he could take down the guys that can outstrike him, and he can outstrike the guys who can take him down. And then he doesn't actually do that in fights. And like, they set up this heavyweight sparring day, him and his dad, where they get in the best heavyweights from Europe. And they did a great video on it on his YouTube channel. It really made me, I mean, Phil DeFree's a legend. He left the UFC as not a very good fighter. He's a guy who took up MMA to lose weight because he was like an alcoholic. And in KSW, he's become like their best fighter ever. He's on something like a 10, 15 fight winning streak as their heavyweight champion. But he was there and he seems like a great bloke. Mick Parkin's a great bloke. And they were like, oh, Mick, you're doing well in the UFC. What's sort of your goal? How can you help Tom prepare for this big fight? And he says, I think just by being a great mate. You're like, oh, what sweet guys all these massive meatheads are. But they had a guy who'd won PFL in there, a guy with $1 million. But yeah, it looked really clever, and it was a great idea because obviously, if you don't know, the British MMA circuit generally is still very rinky-dink. I know guys who are taking fights and then they're having their opponent changed and changed again, and then the weight class is changed, and that's at like a decent level. And the camps are just not, like, there are camps in the UK, but a lot of it is just guys going around getting their jiu-jitsu one place, getting their MMA sparring another place, going somewhere else for Muay Thai, going somewhere else for boxing. So it's cool that Tom Aspinall's dad has actually put together, what you need to have a world heavyweight champion. But then on the other hand, you get things like Tom Aspinall being like, yes, I've been soaking my hands in petrol to make them harder. Like, I really hope he's joking, because that'll give you cancer for a start. But all those old-timey things like Jack Dempsey used to chew pine tar to make his... that one's probably got some merit to it, because if you could improve your jaw muscles, that presumably helps absorb shock. But all the old hand-hardening stuff, and particularly face hardening, guys used to rub their faces to try and prevent cuts. And as it turned out, like, callousing your face leaves big dry bits of it that probably cut easier. What you really want to do is get the Olay on every night. Just picturing the best fighter in the world putting on his Olay and then putting on gloves to sleep in with the moisturizer inside. Anyway, so back to this fight. I can't recall seeing Tom Aspinall have to fight his way up off his back against anyone decent. But then think of the number of heavyweights who are actually good at taking people down and holding them down. It's Curtis Blades, it's Jailton Almeida. It's Tom Aspinall when he fights Volkov. And it's John Jones when he fights Cyril Gane. There's a real skill deficiency in the grappling end of that division. Romanov, maybe, but he's so flawed in other areas that he's not going to get to the top end of the division. Espino was promising for a while, but Romanov bitched out of their fight and then he never got the rematch and had to retire because he was like 45. But I wouldn't be surprised if Curtis Blades can give Tom Aspinall some real trouble once we get past the exchanging. He takes a decent shot. The one that Derek Lewis put him out with was astonishing. Like he dived into an uppercut. He's been in there with big dudes taking big punches. He's got great conditioning because while we're all like, Tom Aspinall's a real athlete compared to these other heavyweights, we don't see him in long fights. I don't think he's gone past the second round ever, has he? No, literally never got to a third round. Whereas monotonous Mr. Blades, when he fought Volkov, he did 25 minutes of takedowns and hold downs. He can go for a heavyweight. It would be sad because if Tom Aspinall loses here, there's going to be a delusional kind of fan who's like, well, that just proves that John Jones fighting Stipe was actually the harder thing to do. It's like, no, Stipe's still been retired for 3 years. They did an announcement 3 years ago on his local news station when he joined the Fire Force full time. He's not been training for this. But anyway, that's another stupid different thing. But, it wouldn't surprise me at all if John Jones could beat Tom Aspinall because Tom Aspinall is such an unknown. There's a whole load of stuff we don't know if he can do. But that's being a heavyweight, isn't it? With Curtis Blades, he's not thought of that highly because we basically know all the stuff that he can't do because he has longer fights and he's been around forever. But by having longer fights and having all that experience, he might be the perfect foil for Tom Aspinall here. Rough night for those in attendance at the old Co-op Arena, though. If your boy Tom Aspinall loses, and then Bilal Muhammad puts on one of the great stinkers and becomes, in a division which has had a few duller champions, the dullest champion. What else have we got going on this card then? The next fight down is one that we're all supposed to care about because all British people love Paddy Pimblett. It's just undeniable. Bangers and mash, the Queen, Paddy Pimblett. Coming off a career-best performance, gassing out against the ghost of Tony Ferguson, he's taking on Bobby Green, which is actually a legitimate fight. Fair enough. Jared Gordon was a legitimate fight. And I like Jordan Levitt, but yeah, this is the thing. Paddy Pimblett's never going to be as bad as people want him to be, but he's definitely not going very far. His striking has just never been able to come on. It was a choice this week between writing the article Lessons from Bilal versus Leon 1 or writing the article Fixing Paddy Pimblett, because there are things that are fixable about him, but then it depends how coachable he is. He's working at a boxing gym and has been for a long time, and he's still in there. Every time he throws a punch, his chin goes way up at the ceiling. Like Derek Brunson, it's just something he can't seem to train out of himself. But he makes it worse for himself by doing things like throwing his right hand and then standing there. And if you throw your right hand and then weave off to your right, or throw your right hand and then throw your left hook afterwards, it's one of the times that you'll get caught the absolute most is when you throw your right hand and then stop. Because you're close enough to hit the opponent, so he's close enough to hit you. You're not behind your lead shoulder. You're probably not shoulder rolling with your rear shoulder because you're not a slick boxer, you're an MMA fighter. Though all MMA fighters should learn to roll down behind their rear shoulder when they throw their rear hand because it gives you more options to end with your rear hand. But for most people, good rule is end combinations with your lead hand because it puts you back behind your lead shoulder and in a safer position. But yeah, that's where Pimblett was getting hit all the time against Jared Gordon. He got hit there a few times against Tony Ferguson even. And, Tony is so far gone at this point. And then he gassed in the third round against Tony, but luckily got a takedown. But he's an odd one because his grappling's good and his back takes are really exceptional. But his single leg is not, well, we haven't seen it against anyone really top-notch, except Tony Ferguson used to have very good wrestling back in the day, but now has no ACLs. Bobby Green can defend a pretty good takedown. He got mugged by Islam Makhachev on the mat, but that's Islam Makhachev. And as Islam Makhachev, to his credit, actually did some pretty good stuff to get in on Bobby Green. I talked about it the other week, him throwing punches to get Bobby Green slipping and then trying to snap him down. And then Bobby Green freaked out, postured up, and gave him the clinch easy. But with Paddy Pimblett, it's like desperation single, hold on to. I mean, he used to wear the Sakuraba shorts because he's a big fan of Sakuraba, and that was very endearing. But Sakuraba used to shoot these bad singles and just hold on to them on his knees, which one of the great rules of wrestling generally is don't do it from your knees. Try and get back up to your feet at every possible opportunity. But Paddy Pimblett is very much like Linton Vassell in that sense. He just holds onto these single legs on his knees, trying to pull the guy in. And sometimes it works, but he takes a beating doing it a lot of the time. Go watch Kazushi Sakuraba versus Ricardo Arona when knees to the head were legal on a grounded opponent. That was one of the truly brutal beatings under that rule set. If I were talking about game plans, I'd be saying for Paddy Pimblett, the Bobby Green teep is a real staple of his game that people don't notice because people don't watch teeps. They don't care about teeps. Teeps are like right straights to the body. People don't look at them because they so rarely result in the guy crumpling over and going, oh no. Everyone likes a big liver shot, the big left hook to the liver, but nobody cares about jabs to the body, right straights to the body, teeps to the body, because it's attritive damage. It wears you down over rounds. But Bobby Green was murdering Jim Miller with them, and he's been using them really well for a while. He uses them as a way to change stance and set up both further punches and counters. So if I'm Paddy Pimblett, if I were Paddy Pimblett's team and they were in camp for this fight, it would be parrying front kicks and entering into dominant clinching positions or just kicking out the standing leg constantly. Because if he throws one, you should be on him. And if you can take that away, Paddy Pimblett's kicking game, pretty good actually. If you have the kicking game and Bobby Green doesn't, you've got a range advantage on him. You don't even have to get into boxing with him. Ideally. But for Bobby Green on the other end, I would throw those front kicks because if he's not catching them, you only know if he's actually good at catching and parrying and taking advantage of them if he does that. So throw him out there, see if he's doing anything, poke his body. He gasses already and no one's really worked his body. So work his body doing that. Look for those counter hooks every time he comes in off one of your kicks. He did that to Jim Miller loads. He'd throw a front kick and then weave out and throw either a left hook or a right hook, depending on his stance, over the top. Bobby Green's going to be looking for that lunging rear hand straight where he steps through. And you just got to be worried about him dropping on your hips. Christian Leroy Duncan versus Gregory Rodriguez. That's a pretty good fight. What's Christian Leroy Duncan on at the moment? Is it a 3-fight winning streak? No, 2-fight winning streak. He lost that one to Petrosian. Armin Petrosian, not the good kickboxer Petrosian. But he finished Dennis Tilulian and Claudio Ribeiro. Dennis Tilulian does truly suck. He's one of the worst fighters in the UFC, but Claudio Ribeiro wasn't too bad. This fight was supposed to be Robert Brycek, which would have been a nice Polish guy in there. Don't have to fly him as far. Save some money for the UFC, which is what they're all about nowadays. Meanwhile, Gregory Rodriguez is coming off that finish over Brad Tavares and also beat Dennis Tilulian. They've both got finishes over Dennis, how are you still here, Tilulian? But before that, obviously got upset by Bruno Ferreira. I like this. Christian Leroy Duncan does a lot of jumping around and being a very tall, long guy in this division. And I think that would be very interesting to see matched up against Gregory Rodriguez, walking forward, taking punches on the face, but getting you near to the fence and roughing you up if he gets the chance. This could be a RoboCop runs onto a flying knee and gets deaded fight, or this could be a RoboCop walks forward, doesn't get folded by a flying knee, and beats up a guy who's just jumped himself out of position sort of fight. Also, if you're RoboCop, probably looking for some takedowns and stuff too, because Duncan his offense is so heavily weighted towards his striking that, RoboCop's actually a pretty good all-rounder. And you can hit him in the clinch too. So, that's a nice in-between. If you've got him defending takedowns, hit him with some elbows. Arnold Allen versus Giga Chodkadze. I'm not really rooting for anyone in any of these matches, but I do root against Giga Chikadze every time he fights. You do have the interesting facet here that Arnold Allen is a southpaw, which means no giga kick, which is just a left kick to the body. But when Giga Chikadze does it, it's a giga kick. I mean, the secret is that he starts orthodox and then he steps back. And either off a combination if they're smart, or he could just step back against some people and they'll step in and he times them with the kick to the body. But not there in the same way against a southpaw, because you're kicking into the closed side, his back, rather than the open side, where it's just defended by his arm. Arnold Allen's going to throw the 1-2, and he's going to throw it really fast. If he can crowd up on Giga Chikadze, which is something that I haven't seen an awful lot of him doing, he tends to sort of circle around and look for good counter 1-2s, use his incredible speed. But Chikadze had a nightmare with Keita just walking him down and throwing straight shots and doing that lovely switch 45, which we don't get a chance to mention much, but he was switching stances so that Giga Chikadze's kick was, his power kick, his rear leg, was always going into Keita's back and not into his body. Or the backside of Keita's body, rather. And man, that Keita fight was back in January of 2022, and he's only fought once since then against Alex Caceres. So, the Giga Chikadze, he was banging through fights, and then it just sort of fell off very quickly once the hype train got derailed. Mohamed Makayev versus Manel Kape. I don't know if this is worth talking about because Manel Kape is going to drop out at some point this week. But I like it. Makayev, so dominant in a way that hasn't seemed dominant. When he gets a hold of someone, he can throw him around, but then when he gets into the mat, he doesn't want to unlock his hands, so he can't strike because he's terrified the guy will jump up, like desperately holding on to Malcolm Gordon, who isn't really that good or much of a threat, off his back even. Like, what's Malcolm Gordon going to do to you if you let go of him? Good submissions, dominating top pressure, but so averse to throwing a strike either on the feet or on the ground. Came out against Charles Johnson, stunned him with the first couple of punches he threw, took Johnson down. Johnson kept jumping up, and then Makayev was just terrified to try anything. He was just holding onto his hips the whole time, trying those short double legs along the fence that then he'd just hop up from again. And, in the strictest sense of like scoring damage over position, there are like 2 rounds of that fight, the second and third, where Johnson lands a couple of shit elbows from defending takedowns, and Makayev lands absolutely nothing because he's pursuing these takedowns at all costs. And in the strictest sense, you could be like, yeah, I'm going to score it for Johnson just to fuck over the wrestle fucker. Makayev coming off that win, but moral, spiritual loss against Alex Perez, where he was just dropping down to his butt, playing the knee to the head rule, which is changing, and we're all very excited about it. But Manel Kape, never been super impressed by his takedown defense. Always a question of whether he's going to turn up and throw hands or not. Sometimes he turns up against people like Pantoja and Nicolau and just doesn't do much and loses. He did that in one of his Kai Asakura fights. Hits very hard, but only sometimes, only if the level of opposition is right. I suspect in this one you will see Makayev probably strangle him at some point, but look absolutely terrified at periods when Kape is swinging at him. Nathaniel Wood versus Daniel Pineda. This one seems like a bit of a setup. Nathaniel Wood, very, very good. Beautiful rhyming, Slacky. Coming off a loss to Naimov, which, if you remember, that was in Abu Dhabi and they just let Naimov cheat his ass off. And that broke a 3-fight winning streak, undefeated in the featherweight division, I believe it was. So fuck Naimov for setting my boy Nathaniel Wood's career back. But Daniel Pineda, been around forever, 38 years old. And if you put him in with good guys, he tends to lose. Cub Swanson got a nice, easy one against him. Jesus, how was that 4 years ago? I was already like Daniel Pineda, kind of old and not that good. But if he beats Nathaniel Wood, that's a great bounce back off that loss to Caceres. The thing that I got overwhelmingly from that Cub Swanson fight was that he just didn't fight smart against a guy who is very much waning in his career. Nathaniel Wood's going to come out and try and chop his legs down. Let's see if Daniel Pineda withdraws his legs or checks. And hopefully Nathaniel Wood hits a couple of those cool outside trips that he loves to do. Molly McCann versus Bruno Brazil. Don't care. Carolyn Loughran versus Jake Hadley. This is an interesting one because this was switched up right at the last minute. Carolyn Loughran was supposed to fight Ramon Tavares. There was talk of the Octagon champion, Sam Creasy, coming in to fight this one. And then they went with something in-house instead. And I think Octagon is trying to change its rules on, because they've had a situation where they let guys go to the UFC if they got the offer, which was really cool when they were starting out. But I suppose at a certain point you have to say, like, now we're trying to be our own thing. So you can't do that anymore. Love watching Jake Hadley. The secret to beating him has always been, he's British Borshev. You just put him on his back, and he's actually a bit better than Borchev off his back, but it is kind of like that. Nick Parkin versus Lucas Brzeski, cool. Sam Patterson's on the card. He's got the longest neck I've ever seen on an MMA fighter. Shauna Bannon. People were going off about this girl that they found to lose to Shauna Bannon. Because Shauna Bannon goes on cards, like Bellator has all the Straight Blast Gym Island fighters. They've got that market sewn up. People who still care about Straight Blast Gym in Ireland will go to those events and watch that stuff. But the UFC got Shauna Bannon, and she is not very good. But the Irish MMA press, which is still a fairly large section of the press, have to like spend the week profiling her and telling us how she actually might be a world beater. Yeah, but the last she's fighting is some Instagram girl or something like that, and people who care about women's MMA were quite mad about that. That being said, this lass has fought Weili Zhang, so she's been in there with fighters who are at least almost as good as Shauna Bannon. And then Modestas Bukakas is on the card because he lives nearby. He's like Milton Keynes, I think. And he's fighting Marcin Bracknell, who's fucking awful. So that's your card. It's all right. Main and co-main matter, but have a good chance of not being super exciting if they go one way that they very easily could go. Super Rizin is also on this weekend. And Rizin, I do like to tell people to watch because it often turns out there's some bangers in Rizin. They are short on like really good fighters, but they find ways to do fun things. Like the main event is Mikuru Asakura, who is a fun fighter, versus Ren Hiramata, who is Tenshin Nasukawa, who just won a minor boxing world title in like his fourth fight. The best kickboxer on the planet for a little while, probably pound for pound. Just, made easy work of Takeru while focusing on boxing, or focusing on his transition to boxing. But Ren Hiramata had a win over him back in the amateur days, and basically everyone who's seen him says, man, he's a really talented kickboxer. And he basically jumped ship from kickboxing to do MMA. Problem is, he's facing all the problems you would expect a kickboxer in MMA to face. But this is a funny one because it's almost like the reverse of his last one. They got him a fight with Yar Man, who is a kickboxer who isn't that good at kickboxing, so they do 4-ounce kickboxing so that he can win. But he took an MMA fight against Ren Hiramata in Rizin, and obviously the one guy who knows a little bit more about takedowns will be easily able to win rounds by timing a takedown. So Ren Hiramata did that. And now Ren Hiramata is going to fight Mikuru Asakura, and it's another, we're going to bang it out on the feet because we're both street fighters thing. And then Mikuru Asakura is probably going to get an easy takedown or two at some point to win on the cards. But Ren Hiramata is a very slick striker, so watch it just in case he gets the chance to show some off. And Mikuru Asakura, if you need a reason to like him, they used to call him the Japanese Diaz brothers, him and his brother Kai. Though Kai is much, much better. And your co-main is Hiramasa Ogakubo, who is unbelievably boring fighter. Something like 40 fights, no finishes. Did have the first win over Kyoji Horiguchi, though, and just beat John Dodson in a very funny fight. But he's fighting Makoto Shinryu, who I've talked about before. Super prospect coming out of Japan. It's him, Tatsuro Tairo, Rei Saruya. There's a few guys coming up out of Japan. I think a few of them train together too. Very impressive. Shinryu is one of them. You've also got Yuta Kubo on the card, and he's the world's most divorced man. He was like the best kickboxer in the world at his weight, and he'd be on Twitter going, my wife doesn't love me. How do I win her back? John Dodson's on the card, though he is not looking great. Hideo Tokoro's on the card, though he is not looking great. Reina Kubota's on the card. She's there for the horny boys. And then Manny Pacquiao versus Rikia Ampo is a fight where they're paying Manny Pacquiao millions to box a kickboxer who's taken like 2 years off from doing anything since he left K1. Rikia Ampo took a year off and then fought kickboxing exhibition against Buakaw, which he didn't look particularly good in, and then lost an MMA fight against Yuta Kubo for no reason. It's Rizin. It's weird. They don't have enough fighters. They have to make shit up as they go. But it can be fun. Anyway, that'll do us for this week. I'll be back on Monday, back on the usual schedule, and I'll see you then. If you haven't read the article and you want to read the article, sign up to the Patreon. If you want to see what I'm writing anytime, fightprimer.com. And if you want to send an email to the podcast, jackslackpodcast@gmail.com. I'm your boy, Jack Slack. Beardless Tom Aspinall freaks me out. Bless.